So, this happened about a year ago, and I still get a weird feeling every time I think about it. I just finished a long day at work and was craving something quick to eat before heading home. I didn't want to cook, and there was a Subway on the way, so I decided to stop there. It was a little out of my usual routine, but I figured, why not? I could grab a sandwich, relax for a bit, and then go home. Nothing out of the ordinary, right? It was around 9 p.m. when I walked into the Subway. The place was almost empty. Just one other customer sitting near the window and the guy behind the counter. I glanced around, kind of happy it was quiet. After a long day, the last thing I wanted was to wait in line. I went up to the counter and ordered my usual foot-long turkey on wheat, all the veggies, no mayo. The guy making my sandwich looked tired, like he was ready to close up and call it a night. I paid for my sandwich, grabbed a drink, and picked a table near the back, away from the window. The other customer was still there. A guy in his mid-30s maybe, wearing a hoodie with the hood pulled up. He was just sitting there, not eating, just kind of staring out the window. I didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe he was just lost in thought or something. We all have those days. I started eating my sandwich, scrolling through my phone, trying to relax. The place was quiet, just the sound of the sandwich artist cleaning up behind the counter and the low hum of the drink machine. After a while, I noticed the guy by the window had turned his head slightly and was looking in my direction. Not directly at me, but just kind of glancing over every now and then. It made me a little uncomfortable, but I brushed it off. I figured he was just spacing out, not really focusing on anything. As I continued eating, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my phone, but every time I looked up, I caught him looking over. I started feeling a little paranoid, thinking maybe I had something on my face or he recognized me from somewhere. I was getting pretty uncomfortable, and I was almost ready to just finish my sandwich and leave. But then something strange happened. The guy in the hoodie stood up. He left his seat by the window and walked over to the counter, asking the sandwich artist for a napkin. I thought he was going to leave after that, but instead he walked past my table and sat down at another table, a couple of seats away from me. Now he was even closer, and he was still glancing over at me every few seconds. I felt my stomach tighten. There was no reason for him to move closer. The whole place was practically empty, so why sit near me? I tried to keep my cool, acting like I didn't notice, but my hands were starting to shake a little. I focused on my phone, scrolling mindlessly, but my thoughts were racing. I was trying to come up with a plan, thinking maybe I should just leave. But then again, what if I was overreacting? What if this guy was just having a bad day and not even paying attention to me? A few minutes passed, and the guy just sat there. Not eating, not drinking, just watching me. I was getting more and more nervous, my heart beating faster. I decided I'd had enough. I picked up my drink and stood up, ready to head for the door. As I did, the guy stood up too. He didn't say anything, didn't do anything, just stood there like he was waiting for me to make a move. I froze. My instincts were screaming at me that something was wrong. I looked over at the counter, hoping maybe the sandwich artist would notice and come over, but he was busy in the back, probably cleaning up. The guy in the hoodie took a step toward me, and that's when I bolted. I grabbed my stuff and headed straight for the door. As I pushed the door open, I glanced back and saw the guy still standing there, watching me. His expression was blank, unreadable, but his eyes were fixed on me, like he was waiting to see what I would do. I didn't stick around to find out. I walked out into the parking lot, trying to keep my cool, but inside I was freaking out. My car was parked a few spaces away from the entrance, and as I walked toward it, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting the guy to follow me out. I didn't see him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. I reached my car, unlocked it, and got inside as quickly as I could, locking the doors behind me. I sat there for a second, trying to catch my breath. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the adrenaline pumping through my veins. I looked back at the subway, and through the glass door, I could see the guy still standing inside, just watching. It sent a shiver down my spine. I started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, glancing back one last time. The guy was still there, just standing at the window, his eyes following me as I drove away. I drove around for a while, trying to calm down, but my mind kept replaying the scene over and over. Why had he moved closer? Why was he just standing there, watching me? I ended up going to a friend's house instead of heading straight home. I didn't want to be alone after that. I told my friend what happened, and they tried to reassure me. saying it was probably just some weirdo and nothing to worry about. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. The way he watched me, the way he moved closer without saying a word. It felt like he was testing me, trying to see how I'd react. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little noise made me jump, and I kept imagining that guy showing up at my window or following me home. The next day, I thought about reporting it to the police, but what would I say? Some guy at Subway was looking at me funny? It sounded ridiculous. I tried to go back to my normal routine, but for weeks I couldn't get that night out of my head. Every time I walked into a Subway or any fast food place, I'd find myself looking over my shoulder, checking to see if he was there. It was irrational, I knew that, but I couldn't help it. A few months later, I heard about a string of incidents in the area. People being followed from restaurants, feeling like they were being watched. There were no real leads, nothing concrete, just a few scattered reports. I never saw that guy again, but every time I think about that night, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did. What if I'd stayed a little longer? What was he planning? It's one of those things that stays with you. Not because it was the most terrifying experience ever, but because it was real and it was personal. It made me realize that sometimes the things that scare us the most aren't the monsters or ghosts, but the people who seem normal on the outside but are hiding something dark inside. And that's a kind of fear that's hard to shake, no matter how much time passes. Now, whenever I go out, especially at night, I'm more aware of my surroundings. I pay attention to the people around me, the ones who seem out of place, the ones who watch without saying anything. It's not about being paranoid, it's about being aware, because sometimes it's the quiet ones, the ones who just sit and watch, that you need to be most careful about. I remember that night vividly because it was one of those moments that sticks with you, the kind of experience that makes you rethink your everyday routine. It was a Thursday, I think. I had just gotten out of work late. I was exhausted, one of those days that never seems to end. You know how it is, meetings that drag on, emails that keep coming no matter how many you answer. By the time I left the office, it was close to 9 p.m., and the idea of cooking dinner felt like climbing a mountain. There's a Subway not too far from my place, and it's usually my go-to when I'm too tired to make anything at home. It's open late, and I could count on getting in and out pretty quickly. Plus, it was on the way back from work, so it was kind of perfect for nights like this. I pulled into the parking lot, which was almost empty except for a couple of cars. The lights inside were bright, almost too bright against the dark street outside. I walked in, and the place was quiet. There was only one other customer, a guy sitting at a table in the corner with his back to the wall. He had a hoodie pulled up over his head, and I couldn't see his face clearly because he was looking down at his phone. The woman behind the counter greeted me with a tired smile, and I ordered my usual, a foot-long turkey sandwich on wheat, all the veggies, no olives, a bag of chips, and a Coke. She made small talk while she prepared my order, and I tried to be polite even though my mind was half asleep. I paid for my food and took a seat near the window, a few tables away from the guy in the hoodie. I figured I'd eat quickly and head home, maybe watch some TV before crashing. As I started unwrapping my sandwich, I glanced over at the guy in the corner. He hadn't moved, still hunched over his phone, and I noticed something odd. He wasn't eating or drinking anything. No food on the table, not even a cup, just him and his phone, sitting there like he was waiting for something. I brushed it off and took a bite of my sandwich, scrolling through my own phone, trying to relax. The place was quiet except for the faint hum of the overhead lights and the occasional clatter from the kitchen as the employee moved around. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, almost too peaceful, like the calm before a storm. About halfway through my sandwich, I looked up again, and the guy in the hoodie was staring straight at me. His face was still partially hidden by the shadow of his hood, but I could see his eyes, dark and unblinking. He wasn't looking at his phone anymore, just at me. I froze for a second, caught off guard by his gaze. It wasn't a casual glance. It was intense, like he was studying me, trying to figure something out. I tried to ignore it, going back to my sandwich, but I could feel his eyes on me. I kept my head down, focusing on my food, but my appetite was gone. Something about his stare was making my skin crawl. It wasn't just that he was looking, it was the way he was doing it. like he was trying to get inside my head. A few minutes passed and I couldn't take it anymore. I glanced up and he was still watching me, his face expressionless. I gave him a weak smile, trying to play it off like it was no big deal, but he didn't react, just kept staring. That's when I noticed something else. His phone was on the table, but the screen was off. He hadn't been looking at it the whole time. He'd just been pretending, using it as an excuse to sit there, unnoticed. I felt a chill run down my spine. My mind started racing, trying to make sense of it. Maybe he was just some guy who'd had a rough day, lost in his thoughts, and I was overreacting. But my gut was telling me otherwise. There was something about him that didn't feel right, something off. I decided to finish up quickly and get out of there. I crumpled up my sandwich wrapper, stuffed it in the bag, and took a sip of my Coke, trying to act casual. As I stood up to throw my trash away, I noticed the guy shift in his seat, like he was getting ready to move. I walked over to the trash can, tossed my bag, and turned back toward the door. He was still sitting, but his eyes followed me the whole way. I pushed open the door and stepped outside into the cool night air, my heart pounding a little faster than it should have been. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was nothing, just some guy minding his own business. But as I headed toward my car, I glanced back through the window. He was standing now, looking out at me, his face half hidden by the hood. He was holding his phone up, pointing it toward me like he was taking a picture or recording a video. That's when the fear really hit me. My hands started shaking, and I fumbled for my keys, trying to get the car unlocked as quickly as possible. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine, my eyes darting back to the subway window. The guy was gone. I scanned the parking lot, but there was no sign of him, just the empty lot and the dimly lit street beyond. I pulled out of the parking lot, my heart racing, and headed straight home. The whole drive, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him following me, but there was no one, just me and the dark, empty road. I got home, locked all the doors, and went around checking the windows, making sure everything was secure. My mind was still racing, replaying the night over and over, trying to figure out what had just happened. I spent the rest of the evening on edge, jumping at every little noise. I kept looking out the window, expecting to see that guy standing outside, but he never showed up. Eventually, I went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, those dark, unblinking eyes staring back at me. The next day, I told a friend about what happened, and they brushed it off, saying I was just being paranoid. Maybe they were right, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. I started avoiding that subway after that, taking a different route home and making sure I was never out alone late at night. I never saw the guy again, but the memory of that night stayed with me. A constant reminder that sometimes, even in the most ordinary places, something can happen that changes the way you see the world. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I'm out late or in a place that's a little too quiet. It's not like I'm scared all the time, but that night taught me to be more aware, to trust my instincts when something doesn't feel right, because you never really know who's watching or what their intentions might be. Alright, here's something that happened to me a while back that still makes me feel uneasy every time I think about it. It was one of those nights when everything seems normal at first, but then things just start to feel off. It was late, maybe around 9:30 p.m., and I just finished a long shift at work. I was tired, hungry, and didn't feel like cooking when I got home. There was a Subway not far from my apartment, and it was one of those 24-hour locations. I figured I'd stop by, grab a sandwich, and take it home to eat. Easy enough, right? When I pulled into the parking lot, I noticed that it was almost empty. Just a couple of cars, one of which I recognized as the employees, because I'd seen it there before. The lights inside the store were bright, and from the outside, everything looked normal. I didn't think much of it, and parked my car close to the entrance. I walked in, and immediately, the smell of freshly baked bread and whatever they used to clean the floors hit me. It was comforting in a weird way, familiar. There was only one guy behind the counter, the usual guy I'd seen a few times before. I nodded at him and he gave me this kind of tired smile, like he was just waiting for his shift to end. I stepped up to the counter and ordered my usual, an Italian BMT on wheat, extra pickles, light mayo. He went through the motions, asking me what I wanted, reaching for the bread and then the toppings. It was all normal, but something about the atmosphere felt different. It's hard to explain, but the place felt quieter than usual, like there was this thick layer of silence pressing down on everything. As the guy was making my sandwich, I looked around the restaurant. It was empty, except for one other customer. He was sitting at a table in the corner, his back to me, staring out the window. At first I didn't think much of it. People eat alone all the time. But then I noticed something odd. He wasn't eating. He didn't have any food or a drink in front of him, just sitting there, completely still. I shrugged it off, figuring he was just waiting for someone or lost in thought. I paid for my sandwich and a drink, grabbed a couple of napkins, and decided to sit at a table instead of taking it to go. I was too tired to drive and eat at the same time, and honestly, I just needed a break before heading home. I picked a table a few rows away from the guy in the corner, far enough to give him space, but close enough that I could see him if I looked up. I unwrapped my sandwich and started eating, scrolling through my phone, checking social media, trying to unwind. About 5 minutes in, I felt that same weird sensation, like I was being watched. I glanced up from my phone, and that's when I realized the guy in the corner had turned around. He was facing me now, his eyes fixed right on me. I tried not to react, just nodded politely. But inside, I was starting to feel that itch of discomfort. His gaze didn't move. He just sat there, staring at me, his face expressionless. I remember thinking he might have been high or drunk, maybe even a little out of it. I've seen people like that before, just zoned out, but there was something different about this guy. His eyes weren't glazed over, they were sharp, focused. I went back to my phone, pretending to scroll, but I could feel his eyes on me. Every now and then, I'd steal a glance to see if he'd looked away, but he didn't. He just kept staring. It was like he didn't even blink. My heart was starting to race a little, and I felt this uneasy feeling growing in the pit of my stomach. The employee behind the counter had disappeared into the back, probably to restock or something, so it was just me and this guy in the restaurant. I decided to finish my sandwich quickly and get out of there. The whole vibe had shifted from slightly weird to downright creepy. I took a sip of my drink, keeping my eyes down, and then I heard a chair scrape against the floor. I looked up and the guy was standing now, still staring right at me. He hadn't moved toward the counter or the door. He was just standing there, his hands hanging at his sides, almost like he was waiting for something. My mind started racing with all sorts of thoughts. Maybe he was going to ask for money, or maybe he was looking for a fight. I didn't know, but I didn't want to find out. I quickly crumpled up my napkin, tossed it on my tray, and stood up to leave. As I made my way to the trash can to throw out my stuff, I could see him out of the corner of my eye. He took a step toward me. Just one step, but enough to make my heart jump. I decided to skip the trash can and head straight for the door. I could throw my trash away outside or back at home. I pushed open the door, the bell above it jingling, and stepped out into the cool night air. I didn't look back. I just walked quickly to my car, unlocked it, and got in. As I fumbled with the keys, trying to get the car started, I finally glanced back at the subway. The guy was standing in the doorway now, watching me. His silhouette was framed by the bright lights of the store, making it hard to see his face clearly, but I could still feel his eyes on me. That same sharp, unblinking gaze. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just stood there, watching as I pulled out of the parking lot. I drove home, my mind racing, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. Maybe he was just some lonely guy. Maybe he was mentally ill. I kept coming up with reasons why he was staring, why he was acting so strange, but none of those reasons made me feel any better. When I got home, I locked the doors and double-checked the windows. I turned on all the lights in the living room and tried to watch TV to distract myself, but I couldn't get the image of that guy's stare out of my mind. It was like his eyes were burned into my brain. That night, I hardly slept. Every little sound made me jump, and I kept thinking I saw movement outside the window, shadows shifting in the dark. I knew it was probably my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next day, I decided to stop by the subway again, in broad daylight this time, just to see if the guy had come back. When I got there, the employee from the night before was working again. I asked him if he'd noticed anything weird last night, if he'd seen the guy watching me. He looked at me, confused, and said he hadn't seen anyone like that. He'd been in the back for a while, he said, restocking the fridge. And when he came back out, the place was empty. No sign of the guy at all. I felt a chill run down my spine. How had he disappeared so quickly? There were no cars in the parking lot when I left. No sign of anyone walking down the street. It was like he'd just vanished. I tried to laugh it off, told the employee it was probably nothing, just my imagination. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. I'd seen that guy standing in the doorway, staring at me like he knew something I didn't. After that, I avoided that subway for a long time. I didn't go back, not even during the day. It wasn't worth the risk. I'd find other places to eat, places that didn't give me that same feeling of unease. Sometimes though, when I'm out late at night, I still get that same sensation, like someone's watching me. I'll look over my shoulder, half expecting to see that guy standing there, eyes locked on mine, waiting. It's probably just paranoia, some leftover fear from that night. But who knows? Maybe he's still out there, watching, waiting for another chance. And that thought, more than anything, is what keeps me looking over my shoulder every time I walk out of a restaurant, especially when the night is dark and the streets are empty.